The Rithanu convocation chamber smelled like warm copper and something faintly floral, a scent conditioning system, I was told later, calibrated to promote what the Rithanu considered optimal cognitive clarity. It was the same temperature as a cool autumn morning in Edinburgh, and the light came from bioluminescent strips recessed into the ceiling that pulsed very gently, the way a sleeping creature breathes. Everything about the chamber was designed to put delegates at ease. The lighting was soft enough to be kind to elder plumage. The seating was tiered and acoustically arranged, so that a voice from the central floor carried to every corner without amplification or strain. Even the scent, which I found pleasant in a neutral, institutional way, had the quality of a room that had thought about your comfort before you arrived and made quiet preparations. I sat in the observer gallery, 2 rows up from the rail, with a thermos of cold coffee and a data tablet I was supposed to be using for note-taking, and I watched the most powerful deliberative body in the outer reach vote to classify humanity as not worth their time. I should explain how I got there. My name is Callum Osei. In the spring of 2271, I was 29 years old, 3 years out of the Diplomatic Service's Junior Attaché program, and I had been assigned as aide and travel secretary to one Maren Voss, senior envoy, first tier, Earth Diplomatic Compact. At the time I thought the assignment was a formality, a filing exercise. The Rithanu convocation had been meeting in some form for approximately 400 years, and the Earth Diplomatic Compact had been attempting to secure an observer's seat at it for 11 of those years. The previous 4 envoys had come back empty-handed and filed reports that ranged in tone from cautiously disappointed to quietly baffled. Envoy Dalseth had called the convocation's admissions process opaque and procedurally insular. Envoy Marchetti had described the Rithanu as courteous in a way that forecloses conversation. Envoy Park had written, in the final paragraph of her report, that she suspected the convocation's committee structure was designed to route applications to a point where no single individual had the authority to accept or reject them, and therefore no individual would ever have to. Maren had read all 4 reports. I know because I filed them for her, along with the 318 pages of supporting documentation that accompanied them, and she had returned them to me with margin notes in a fine, precise hand. She was 53. She had short gray hair she kept neat without apparent effort, a habit of wearing the same style of plain charcoal jacket in every situation regardless of the occasion's formality, and a way of listening that made you feel like she was reading the space between your words. She had been doing this specific job, negotiating with species that did not want to negotiate, for 21 years, which was longer than I had been doing anything. In that time, she had been involved in 37 formal diplomatic proceedings, 14 of which had concluded successfully by the Compact's metrics, and the rest of which had concluded in the various ways that difficult things conclude when the parties involved do not share the same definition of success. She didn't raise her voice. I never heard her raise her voice in 3 years. She had the quality, common to very experienced diplomats and very experienced surgeons, of appearing mildly interested in the thing in front of her even when the thing in front of her was a crisis. I asked her about this once, on a long transit between the Vithara relay station and the Kasayath approach corridor, when we had 3 hours and nothing particular to do, and she thought about the question for a moment with the same mild interest she gave everything. There's a difference, she said, between a crisis and a problem. Problems have solutions. Crises have outcomes. If you're alarmed during a crisis, you spend your energy on the alarm. The outcome doesn't care whether you were alarmed. And if it really is a crisis, then you find out what kind of outcome is still available, and you work toward that. What if none of them are good? She picked up her tea. Then you pick the least bad one and you do it carefully. She drank her tea. I thought about this for the rest of the transit. We arrived at the Rithanu home world, Kasayath, 11 days before the convocation's scheduled plenary session. From the approach corridor, Cassioth was a world of deep amber-green continents and pale silver oceans, which I thought was striking, and which Maren noted in her log as visually distinctive, atmospheric conditions nominal. Our ship was a compact diplomatic courier, nothing impressive, which was either a diplomatic calculation or a budget constraint, and I suspected it was both. The approach was cleared quickly, which I took as a good sign before I understood that the Rithanu processed all arrivals quickly regardless of their significance, because efficiency was one of the things they considered fundamental to a well-run institution. The Rithanu themselves are tall nearly 2.5 meters, on average, with a narrow build and plumage that runs from deep amber to a burnished near black depending on age and caste. Their faces are flat and wide, with large amber eyes that catch light the way a bird's do, and they move with a slow, deliberate elegance that makes every gesture look considered. Their hands four-fingered, with an opposed thumb and a fine dexterity that becomes apparent when you watch them work, are in constant subtle motion, adjusting feathers, touching surfaces, making small unconscious gestures that I later learned carried social meaning I was not yet equipped to read. An older Rithanu, one whose plumage has darkened toward that deep burnished near black, moves through space as though they have been in every room they enter many times before, and perhaps they have. They are not an aggressive species. They are not, in the ways that matter, cruel. They are simply, and this is the kindest word I can find, certain. The Rithanu have been at the center of the outer reaches political architecture for so long that their certainty has calcified into something close to institutional reflex. They don't dismiss you with contempt. They dismiss you with procedure, which is a much more difficult thing to argue with, because procedure has the weight of precedent and the comfort of consistency, and everyone involved can feel that they have behaved correctly even as nothing changes. Our reception was perfectly courteous. We were met at the port by a junior protocol officer named Veshin, who had a very good translator implant and an expression of careful, practiced welcome, and who guided us to the diplomatic quarter with the smooth efficiency of someone who has escorted many delegations and knows which ones matter, and which ones are formalities that must nonetheless be processed. He told us about the quarter's amenities, the climate management, the communication access points, the scheduled hours for common facilities, with the thoroughness of someone who has given this information many times and considers it his responsibility to give it fully even when the recipient is not listening closely. Maren listened closely. She asked 2 questions that I could tell he had not been asked before, both of them procedural, and noted his answers in her personal log. I noted the slight pause before he answered the second question. That evening, in our assigned suite in the diplomatic quarter, Maren sat at the table with the 4 previous envoy reports open side by side on her screen and read them again. I sat across from her with a cup of actual good tea. I had learned to travel with my own, a lesson learned at some personal cost on a previous posting, and reviewed the convocation's procedural charter, which ran to approximately 900 pages in the current translation, and had last been formally amended 62 years prior. The charter had the specific quality of very old legal language, precise in some places to the point of granularity, vague in others in ways that suggested the drafters had been uncertain, and had resolved their uncertainty by using words that would require future interpretation. 900 pages of human diplomatic history had taught me that documents written by very certain people are often full of this kind of structured ambiguity, because certainty tends to mistake its current conditions for permanent ones. "Tell me what you find," Maren said, without looking up from the reports. I read for an hour and 40 minutes. I made notes. I cross-referenced definitions. I followed footnotes into appendices and followed appendices back into the main text, and I built a small map in my tablet of the sections that connected in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Then I found it. Article 12, Subclause 9 of the Rithanu Convocation's founding charter, the clause that governed status votes, specifically votes on the classification of species seeking entry to the Convocation's recognition framework, stated, in language that had been translated, retranslated, and cross-referenced across 2 centuries of diplomatic exchanges. Any species represented by a named individual physically present within the chamber during the conduct of a status vote retains automatic procedural right of reply prior to the vote's formal entry into the record. Said right of reply to be exercised from the floor, not the gallery, and said right to be invocable by the individual's own declaration to the presiding officer within the session window. I read it twice. Then I read the definition of chamber. The chamber, for purposes of Article 12, Subclause 9, was defined as the full convocation space including its observer gallery, provided the observer's entry had been formally logged with the session secretariat prior to the opening of proceedings. The definition had a footnote directing readers to Appendix C, which contained the original language, which was slightly different from the translated version, though the core definition survived translation intact. I read Appendix C. I read the secondary definition in Subappendix 7. I read the amendment history to determine whether the definition had ever been altered, and it had not. I set my cup down. Article 12, Subclause 9, I said. Maren looked up. She read where I was pointing on my tablet. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone who is confirming something they had suspected but had not yet been able to confirm, which has a different texture than the quiet of discovery. Register me as a named observer for the plenary session, she said. Full name, title, species classification, Earth Diplomatic Compact credential number, with the session secretariat, not the general visitor log. File it tonight. Tonight. The session opens in 9 days. I'd like the paperwork to be boring by the time anyone thinks to check it. I filed it that night. The process was straightforward. The session secretariat had an online registration system, automated, designed for the administrative processing of the many small delegations and observer parties that pass through the convocation's facilities on a regular basis. The form asked for name, species, affiliation, credential number, and the specific session to which the registration applied. I filled it in correctly and completely. The confirmation came back within the hour, automated, routine, the kind of administrative receipt that gets logged and filed, and almost certainly never read by any individual capable of understanding its significance. I saved the confirmation in 3 separate locations and noted the reference number in my personal log with a timestamp. Then I went to sleep, and I did not quite understand what we had just set in motion, though I had a feeling that I would understand it soon. Over the next 9 days, Maren attended every preparatory reception she was invited to, which was 3. She was gracious at all of them in the specific way she was gracious at everything, attentive, unhurried, asking questions that were informed without being probing. She ate the food they served, which was edible if slightly bitter, and made no comment about it. She thanked every delegate who spoke to her and remembered their names afterward without referring to notes. The first reception was hosted by the Convocation's General Secretariat, a welcoming event for newly arrived delegations, held in a high-ceilinged reception hall adjacent to the main administrative complex. There were perhaps 60 people there, representing delegations at various levels of engagement with the convocation. Maren moved through the room with the systematic patience of someone working a purpose. She spoke to 9 delegates in 2 hours. 7 of them were Rithanu of various ranks. 2 were from associate member species, a compact, wide-shouldered Valethian named Dresev who had been stationed on Kasayath for 4 years, and a quieter individual from the Yetharn sector, whose translator rendered their speech with the slight half-second delay that suggests a less common dialect. She collected nothing dramatic from any of them, but she collected something from each, and I watched her file it in the log afterward with the same care she gave everything. The second was a dinner hosted by the Valethian delegation, which occupied a suite 3 floors above ours in the diplomatic quarter, and had the relaxed, established quality of a delegation that has been here long enough to have opinions about the catering. The Valethians were, among the non-Rithanu member species, the ones who understood the convocation's internal culture best. They had been full members for 80 years and associated for 40 before that, and the institutional knowledge had accumulated in their delegation, the way knowledge accumulates in any organization that makes a point of remembering. Dresav was there. He was good company, easy to talk with, and had the slightly over-candid quality of someone who has been stationed abroad long enough to have lost patience with certain forms of diplomatic circumspection. He told Maren, over the 4th course, that the compact's applications had been read carefully each year, that the committee's assessments were genuine rather than dismissive, and that the threshold metrics were what they were. "Is there anything that moves the thresholds?" Maren asked. He thought about this, demonstrated capability, which is usually a fleet matter. "Or procedural engagement," she said. He looked at her with his wide-set eyes. "In theory. Has there been precedent?" He thought again. There was a case, Orathi, maybe 30 years back. Classification was Category 3 emerging. There was some discussion of their direct engagement with the process being a factor. He shrugged, which the translator rendered as a small forward roll of the shoulders. But they also had a fleet by then. Who was presiding at that session? "Setharan," he said. "He's been there as long as anyone." Maren thanked him for the information and moved on to the dessert course. I made a note. On the evening of the 4th day, we attended a small informal gathering hosted by the Convocation's Archivist Corps, not an official reception, just the kind of low-key gathering that forms in institutional settings when people who work in the same building find an excuse to spend time with colleagues from outside it. Maren had heard about it from the Valethian aide, Dresav's assistant, a young woman named Terath who had the energy of someone who likes people and acts on it. We were perhaps the only delegation there who had been specifically invited rather than generally included, which I found interesting. The archivist Maren spent time with was named Haveth, older, with plumage that had gone to a distinguished mid-tone, and the specific manner of someone who loves the material they work with. He talked about convocation history the way some people talk about gardening, with a comfortable fluency that assumed you would be interested and was pleased when you were. Maren asked about the last status vote. He told her about the Orathi. She asked about the process, and he explained it with the careful thoroughness of a man who enjoys explaining things to someone who is actually listening. She asked how observers were handled during status votes. He told her that observers were typically cleared from the gallery prior to the vote, as custom, and that in his personal experience covering 41 years of session records, no observer had ever remained in the gallery during a status vote on their own species. He said it with the comfortable certainty of someone describing something that has never happened and therefore does not need examining. "Has anyone ever invoked Article 12, Subclause 9? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. "You've read the charter," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite surprise, more the recognition of a quality he hadn't anticipated. "I read all the appendices," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "In my time, no. There may have been historical instances. The charter's drafting period was complex, and the early sessions had different dynamics." He paused. "The clause was always considered theoretical." "That's interesting," Maren said. "Thank you." She also spent a significant portion of the 9 days reading. She read everything available about the convocation's recent session history. She read procedural records going back 40 years. She read delegate biographies and committee membership records and the full transcripts of 3 previous status votes, including the one involving the Orathi. She read, specifically and carefully, every record she could access of how Setheron had handled procedural challenges in his 19 years as presiding officer. There were 6 instances. In all 6, he had ruled by the letter of the charter. She did not comment on this to me. She wrote a single line in her personal log that I read over her shoulder. Consistent. She also made one purchase from the diplomatic quarters administrative supplies office, a pad of physical paper and a pen that used a pressure-sensitive ink suitable for any atmospheric condition. When I asked what it was for, she said, preparation. On the evening before the session, she pressed her jacket herself. I offered, she declined. The plenary session opened on a morning that felt, through the diplomatic quarters climate management, identical to every other morning. The same copper scent, the same cool light, the same faint pulse of bioluminescence along the corridor ceilings. Maren and I arrived at the convocation chamber 40 minutes before the session opened. We presented our credentials at the secretariat desk at the main entrance. The clerk, a young Rithanu with amber plumage not yet darkened to the elder tones, which made her perhaps equivalent in institutional experience to a third-year civil servant, checked the log with practiced efficiency, found our entry, and issued gallery passes with a scan of our credential documents. The process took 4 minutes. She handed us the passes without particular comment. We went up to the gallery. We found seats 2 rows from the rail, with a clear sightline to the chamber floor and to the presiding officer's dais. Maren settled into the seat with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, arranged her tablet on her knee, and produced from her jacket pocket a nutrition bar in a foil wrapper, which she began eating with the unhurried calm of someone who has eaten in more consequential rooms than this and found it fine. I kept my tablet open on the observer entry confirmation. Reference number noted. Timestamp of our gallery pass scan noted. I checked the session secretariat log twice through the observer access portal. We were in it. Clear, correct, timestamp before the opening of proceedings. The chamber itself was extraordinary, and I say that having been in a moderate number of important rooms by that point in my career. It was a wide oval, deep rather than tall, with tiered seating arranged in concentric arcs descending toward the central floor where the presiding officer's dais stood. The ceiling was distant and vaulted, lit with the same bioluminescent strips I'd grown accustomed to, and the acoustics were engineered so that a voice from the central floor carried clearly to every seat without amplification. The engineering of this, the particular shape of the vault, the angle of the tiers, the material treatment of the surfaces, was, I learned later, the product of 300 years of architectural refinement. The Rithanu had built this room to be perfect for speaking in, and they had been doing it long enough to get it right. Around the full perimeter of the chamber, at regular intervals between the seating arcs, were carved the names of every species that had ever held a seat in this chamber: full members, associate members, historical members, species that no longer existed. The carving was deep and careful, done in some stone that had a faint internal luminescence under the chamber lighting. I counted them during the administrative portion of the session, when my attention was not required elsewhere. There were 247 names. The delegates filed in with the composed efficiency of a body that has been convening for 4 centuries. Senior delegates in deep darkened plumage occupied the inner ring, their movements unhurried and their attention focused in the specific way of people who have come prepared. Junior delegates and observer delegations filled the outer arcs. Non-Rithanu members, there were 14 non-Rithanu species with full member status, another 9 with associate status, occupied a distinct quadrant, and I watched them settle in with various degrees of ceremony. By the time the presiding officer called the session to order, there were perhaps 300 individuals in the chamber. I counted. The presiding officer was an elder Rithanu named Setheron. I had prepared his biography carefully, who had led the chamber for 19 years, and who had the specific unhurried manner of someone who has not been surprised by a meeting room in a very long time. He opened the session with a formal address that the translator rendered smoothly, and which established the session's agenda and procedural ground rules with the efficiency of a man who has given this address many times and sees no reason to vary it unnecessarily. The first hour of the session was administrative business, resolution confirmations from the previous session, ratification of agreements, a procedural amendment concerning the Valethian Sector Compact that generated a moderate discussion, which I followed with half my attention while using the other half to watch the chamber dynamics, who talked to whom during the brief pauses, which delegates leaned toward which others, where the informal centers of gravity were in a room that had a very clear formal structure. These are the things that a good attaché learns to map, because they tell you where the actual decisions are made and where the announced decisions are ratified, and those are not always the same place. Maren's nutrition bar was finished before the Valethian amendment resolved. She folded the wrapper with care and put it in her jacket pocket. Cetheron announced the status review docket with a brief preamble about the committee's thoroughness and the convocation's commitment to accurate classification. The chamber's attention focused in a way that was palpable even from the gallery, the small shifts in posture, the slight increase in the stillness that follows settling, the particular quality of a room that has arrived at the part of the meeting that everyone actually came for. Status reviews were the convocation's real business, not the only business, but the business that carried the most weight. To be classified by the Rethanu convocation was to be located within the political architecture of the outer reach, to have a position, a category, a set of expectations attached to you that would govern how other member species interacted with you for years or decades, or in some cases, generations. To be unclassified was to exist outside the architecture. It was not, strictly speaking, a hostile position. You were not an enemy. You were simply not yet a fact. There were 7 items on the status review docket. The 5th was humanity. I had not known we were on the docket at all. The docket had not been circulated to us, a detail that I noted and filed and did not comment on to Maren, because she had presumably already noted it herself. I sat in my gallery seat and watched the chamber below and kept my expression neutral, which is a skill that takes some practice and which I had been practicing. The presenter rose from his seat in the inner ring and walked to the presentation podium with the careful, unhurried certainty of someone who has made many presentations and knows how this one will go. His name was Voroshan. I had his biography memorized. He was one of the elder Rethanu, which showed in the deep burnished near black of his plumage and in the economical precision of his movements, nothing wasted, every gesture considered. He had been the convocation's senior classifier for 12 years. Before that, he had been a junior member of the committee for 9. He had participated in 23 status votes in his career, and his recommendations had been adopted in all 23. He was, by every measure I had, the chamber's most respected voice on the question of who belonged there and who did not. He opened with a historical summary that was accurate and thorough. Humanity had submitted applications for observer status 11 years running. The applications had been correctly filed and had been reviewed by the classification committee each year. Humanity's last direct diplomatic contact with convocation member species had been a trade negotiation with the Valethian sector delegation 7 years prior, which had concluded without formal agreement, but without ill feeling. Humanity's current capability metrics, fleet tonnage, territorial reach, economic integration with the broader outer reach trading networks, depth of scientific and cultural exchange with member species, placed it, by the convocation's assessment criteria, in the category for range. A species in early development, engaged with the broader galaxy at a limited level, not yet at the threshold for meaningful formal engagement. He went through the metrics carefully and without editorializing, which I appreciated. He was not contemptuous. He was thorough. The numbers were what they were, and he presented them as such. Then he made a small gesture, a tilt of the head, a spreading of the wing feathers at his shoulder, just slightly, in the way that I had by then learned to recognize as indicating a shift from formal to slightly less formal, and said something that the translator implant rendered as, "It must be noted, in fairness, that the compact's representatives have been persistent. 11 submissions is a considerable number. We have received their forms with regularity, and they have been filed with equal regularity." Soft trilling laughter from the chamber, not sharp, comfortable the way laughter is when a room is among friends and someone has said something that captures a shared understanding. "It is the view of the classification committee," Voroshan continued in a tone that remained not unkind, "that this persistence represents not a diplomatic capacity but an administrative one. Humanity is very good at filling out forms. We do not dispute this. The forms are consistently correct, consistently complete, consistently filed within the submission window. The compact's administrative staff is clearly competent. What the forms represent, however, is a species that understands the procedure of engagement better than the substance of it, which is perhaps a necessary first step, but not a sufficient one." More laughter, warmer this time. A few of the delegates in the inner ring exchanged small gestures that the translator didn't try to render, which were the kind of exchanges that happen when a room agrees with something and enjoys agreeing with it. Voroshan continued with the committee's formal recommendation, Category 4, unobserved, pending review in 30 years or upon material change in species capability, whichever occurred first. The compact's latest submission was noted. Their 11 years of submissions were formally acknowledged. The committee thanked them for their consistent engagement with the convocations process. He returned to his seat. Setharon asked if there was discussion from the floor. There was moderate discussion. A delegate from the Yetharn sector raised a question about the specific metric thresholds for the Category 4 designation. A Valethian senior delegate asked for clarification on the 30-year review timeline and whether it could be accelerated. 2 others made brief comments in support of the recommendation. One delegate, young, amber-plumed, from what I gathered, was a smaller member species in the outer reaches, asked whether the compact had been informed of the committee's recommendation prior to this session. Voroshan answered that the compact had not been formally notified, as the procedural guidelines did not require notification prior to the vote's entry into the record, only afterward. The young delegate accepted this and sat down. The discussion ran approximately 20 minutes. Setharon indicated that the chamber appeared ready to proceed to the formal vote. He asked for any final comments. That was when Maren stood up. She stood in the observer gallery, 2 rows up from the rail, in her slightly wrinkled charcoal jacket, and she said, in a clear, level voice, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud to fill a room that has been acoustically optimized to carry every voice, "Presiding officer, I invoke Article 12, Subclause 9. The chamber went quiet. Not the quiet of a room waiting for the next item on the agenda. The quiet of a room that has been interrupted by something it was not expecting and is in the process of locating the appropriate response. In a chamber that has been meeting for 400 years, this is a specific silence with a specific texture. I felt it from the gallery, which was, by the terms of Article 12, Subclause 9, part of the chamber. Setharon turned toward the gallery with the measured deliberateness of someone whose reflexes have been refined by 19 years of chairing sessions in this room. His large amber eyes found Maren without difficulty. We were 2 of perhaps 12 people in the gallery, and the only non-Rithanu in it. He said, in a tone that I can only describe as carefully, professionally neutral, "Identify yourself for the record." Maren Voss, Senior Envoy, First Tier, Earth Diplomatic Compact. Observer registration filed with the Session Secretariat 9 days ago. She glanced at me. Reference number. I had it on my tablet, cued precisely for this moment. I read it aloud. The translator rendered it into the chamber's record. Setheron turned to the session clerk, the same young amber-plumed clerk who had issued our gallery passes, with an instruction that was too low for the gallery to hear. The clerk checked the log. The process took perhaps 30 seconds, which is a long time in a quiet room with 300 people in it. Whatever the clerk found in the log, the pause that followed was brief, and her expression was the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they would have preferred not to confirm. She murmured to Setheron. He absorbed what she said. He looked back up at the gallery. "Your entry is confirmed as pre-session," he said. "Thank you," Maren said. Voroshan, from his seat in the inner ring, had turned fully around to face the gallery. His expression was not readable to me. I was still building my vocabulary for Rithanu faces, but his posture had changed in a way I could not precisely describe except to say that it was the posture of a very certain person who has just encountered a variable they did not account for, and is in the early stages of accounting for it. The chamber, which had been quiet, became a different kind of quiet. The first quiet was surprise. This quiet was the sound of 300 people doing the same calculation. Maren descended from the gallery. There was a side corridor. I had found it on the chamber's architectural plan 3 days earlier and walked it twice to confirm the route that connected the observer gallery to the chamber floor level. She came down it with the unhurried ease of someone who has thought through exactly this walk and found nothing difficult about it. She crossed the floor. She stepped to the speaker's position, which was a slightly raised platform in front of the presiding officer's dais, designed so that a speaker addressing the chamber faced both the presiding officer and the assembled delegates simultaneously. She had never been in this room before. She walked to the speaker's position as though she had used it before. 300 delegates watched her. The chamber was as quiet as the inside of a held breath. She looked at Setheron. She said, "Thank you for hearing me." He nodded once. "You have the floor." She didn't look at notes. She didn't look at a tablet. She looked at the chamber, the full sweep of it, the 300 faces, the carved names on the walls, the deep vault of the ceiling, the bioluminescent light. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, with attention, without urgency. "I've heard the committee's assessment," she said. "I have no quarrel with most of it. Our fleet is small by your metrics. Our reach is limited by your standards. Our 11 submissions have been correctly filed and returned unaccepted, which is an accurate summary of the situation." She paused, one beat. "I'm not here to argue the merits of the classification. That's not what Article 12, Subclause 9 provides for. What it provides for is the record, the right to be present on the record correctly before the vote is entered. I'm exercising that right." She glanced toward Voroshan, who was still turned in his seat, watching her with large, very still amber eyes. "The committee said humanity is good at filling out forms," she said. "That's accurate. We've read yours carefully as well." She reached into the interior pocket of her charcoal jacket and produced a single folded sheet, physical paper, which I had watched her prepare the previous night, writing by hand in small, careful script. She placed it on the speaker's podium and smoothed it with one hand in the way you smooth something that you have prepared deliberately and want to present correctly. "This is a formal notice," she said, "that the Earth Diplomatic Compact's named representative was present in this chamber from the opening of today's session. The observer entry timestamp is in the Secretariat log. The delegate making the classification recommendation concluded his presentation at session time 47 minutes 14 seconds, as I recorded it from the gallery. My observer entry was logged at session time 0. A pause. I was in the gallery before the vote. I was here during the assessment. I was here during the discussion." She looked up from the paper. "I ate a nutrition bar during the Valethian sector amendment. I can describe the wrapper if that would be useful for the record." No one in the chamber laughed. The silence was of a different quality than any previous silence. It was the silence of a room that has registered a situation and is deciding, collectively, how to hold it. "I don't dispute the classification," she said. "Category 4, unobserved, is probably accurate as a metric assessment. What I am requesting, formally, for the record, which is what Article 12, Subclause 9 provides for, is that the record reflect that a representative of the species under review was present in this chamber while that review was conducted, that she was observing while being classified as unworthy of observation, that she found the proceedings instructive. She picked up the paper. I would like the record to note that we were here." She placed the paper back down, aligned it neatly, and stepped back from the podium. Cetheron was quiet. He had the quality of a very experienced chair. Whatever he was feeling, the 19 years of sessions had built a structure around it that was not visible from the outside. But his eyes moved to Voroshan, and Voroshan's eyes moved back, and between those two amber gazes was the entire unspoken architecture of a procedural situation that had not arisen in 62 years. "The chair," Cetheron said at last, with the careful precision of a man selecting his words from a short list of appropriate ones, "will take a brief recess to confirm the procedural record." He called 15 minutes. It ran 22. I came down from the gallery during the recess. Maren was standing near the speaker's podium. A junior clerk was reviewing documents beside her, with the focused attention of someone hoping very much that the documents will say something other than what they appear to say. They appeared to say what they said. After several minutes he folded the papers, murmured an apology in Maren's direction, and went to find someone with more authority. That person arrived, reviewed the same documents, murmured to the first clerk, and also went to find someone with more authority. This process repeated twice more before reaching Cetheron's chief administrative aide, who read everything, asked Maren 2 precise questions, received 2 precise answers, and walked back to the presiding officer's preparation room with the expression of a man carrying news he would have preferred not to carry. Around us, the chamber was in the state that meeting rooms achieve during unexpected recesses. A low-grade controlled unease, the sound of delegates speaking quietly to adjacent colleagues, the particular atmosphere of a deliberative body that knows something unusual has happened and is sorting through its implications. In the inner ring, I watched several of the senior delegates hold a compact, standing conversation. Voroshan was part of it. He was listening more than he was speaking, which was the opposite of his usual role in this room, and his posture had the careful stillness of someone who is engaged in a precise internal reassessment. The Valethian senior delegate, Dresev Superior, caught my eye from the third arc and gave me a look that I could not fully interpret but which contained, I thought, something like recognition, the expression of someone who has just seen something they did not predict but can, in retrospect, understand. I stood next to Maren. I said quietly, "Do you want the charter appendix?" "Not yet." "The definition of chamber from subappendix 7. I printed it." She glanced at me. "You printed it?" "Last night, after you pressed your jacket." "Hold on to it," she said. "If Cetheron asks, we produce it. If he doesn't, we don't need to." "You don't think we'll need it?" She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the presiding officer's dais, currently unoccupied, and at the carved names on the chamber walls behind it, 247 of them in their careful deep-cut rows. "I think Cetheron is a man who has been running this chamber for 19 years because he reads the documents carefully and honors what they say." She paused. "If that's true, he'll find subappendix 7 himself." "And if it's not true?" "Then we produce it," she said, "and he finds it with help, and the record reflects that too." She was quiet after that. We waited. The clerks came and went. The inner ring delegates concluded their standing conversation and returned to their seats, and the chamber settled into the particular patience of a deliberative body that has encountered a situation it did not schedule and is processing it within the only framework it knows. She was right. The recess ran 22 minutes. When Setheron returned, he had the composed gravity of someone who has looked at an unpleasant situation from every angle available to a careful person, and concluded that all the angles are unpleasant, and has then decided what to do anyway. He called the chamber back to order. 300 delegates settled. The room was very still. "The chair has reviewed the session record," he said, in the precise carrying voice of the chamber's acoustics at their most formal. "The observer entry of Maren Voss, named representative of the Earth Diplomatic Compact, was confirmed with the session secretariat prior to the opening of proceedings. The timestamp places the entry before the session opening. The definition of chamber in Article 12, Subclause 9 includes the observer gallery when entry has been pre-logged with the session secretariat. Both conditions are met." He paused. "Article 12, Subclause 9 is applicable to today's proceedings." He looked at Maren, who had returned to the speaker's position. "The committee's recommendation cannot proceed to the formal vote record without the named representative's procedural right of reply having been exercised and formally entered." "The right of reply has been exercised and entered," Maren said. "It has," Setheron said. "The chair asks whether the named representative has any further exercise of procedural right under the applicable clause." "No," she said. "Thank you, presiding officer." He nodded. Then he said something that I am certain was not prepared, because it came after a pause of the kind that follows an internal decision. The pause of a man choosing to say something he was not required to say, but had decided, on reflection, to say. "The chair also notes for the record that the committee's characterization of the compact's engagement as administrative rather than diplomatic was offered prior to the chair's awareness that a named representative of the compact was present in this chamber. In light of that fact, the chair considers the characterization to warrant revision in the session record." He looked at Voroshan, who was sitting very still in his inner ring seat. Voroshan gave a small, precise nod, the nod of a man with 23 perfect classification votes who is, for the first time, experiencing the 24th. "The status vote on the Earth Diplomatic Compact is tabled," Setheron said, "pending procedural review and redocketing. The session will proceed to item 6. That was all. We were escorted out by Veshin, who had materialized at some point during the recess. I did not see him arrive, with the expression of someone who has been handed an administrative situation of unusual character and is processing it with great professionalism. He walked us through the chamber's main corridor and into the long marble-floored anteroom, which had the quiet of a room used for serious things, and at the far end of which our passage to the diplomatic quarter began. At the door he stopped. He looked at Maren with those large amber eyes. Veshin was young, his plumage still the light, rich amber of a junior official, and said, with the careful courtesy of someone asking a question they are not entirely certain is appropriate, "Envoy Voss, may I ask, did you intend this outcome when you filed the observer registration?" Maren considered the question with her characteristic mild interest. "I filed the registration," she said. "The outcome depended on the charter." He was quiet for a moment. "We were not expecting you to be here." "I know," she said. "We filed the form." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he gave the small bow he had given at our arrival. Then he walked us to the port personally, which was several levels above his assigned responsibilities and which he did without comment or fanfare. That was 4 years ago. In the weeks that followed, the session record went through the convocation standard transcription and review process, which typically takes 6 to 8 weeks and produces a document that is then circulated to all member delegations. The record of our session ran to 41 pages. On page 27, there was a paragraph. It was transcribed accurately, in the careful formal language the convocation used for everything, and it said, in substance, The presiding officer noted for the record that the committee's characterization of the compact's engagement as administrative, rather than diplomatic, had been offered prior to the presiding officer's awareness that a named compact representative was present in the chamber during the proceedings, and the presiding officer directed that the characterization be revised accordingly in the permanent record. That paragraph was the one most cited in the compact's internal training materials in the years that followed. I know because I wrote one of the training documents and cited it myself. In the 2 years after the session, the compact submitted another observer application. The application included the plenary session record as an appendix, with Article 12, Subclause 9 cited as evidence of direct procedural engagement with the convocations process. The application was formally docketed. It was reviewed by the classification committee, which by then had a new member. Voroshan was still on it, which I found clarifying. The convocation scheduled a formal reconsideration hearing, which was itself unusual. The last reconsideration hearing had been 31 years earlier. We attended it. Maren spoke for 11 minutes. Voroshan asked 4 questions, all of them precise and all of them good questions, and Maren answered them all without consulting notes. We were granted associate observer status the following spring. The vote was not unanimous, nothing in a room of that size and that history is ever unanimous, but it was a clear majority. Voroshan voted in favor. I noted this and said nothing about it in my official log, but I thought about it. Associate observer status is not a seat. It is the step before a seat. It comes with the right to be present at all sessions, the right to be formally consulted on matters affecting species below full member threshold, and the right to submit formal documentation to the record. It is, by the convocation's own classification framework, the difference between existing outside the architecture and existing at its edge. It is the difference between the carving on the wall being only 247 names and being 248. I attended the carving ceremony, which was a small and formal thing held on the chamber floor on the first morning of the following session. Setharon presided. The craftsperson doing the carving was an older Rithanu with steady hands and deep near-black plumage, and the work took about 20 minutes of focused attention with a tool I did not recognize. The name went in on the east wall, between 2 others whose species I did not know. The ceremony was brief, precise, and largely attended by Rithanu officials whose role required them to be there, plus ourselves, plus Dresev from the Valethian delegation, who had come as a personal gesture, and who shook my hand afterward in the human manner, which he had learned and deployed at exactly the right moment. Voroshan was not at the ceremony. I don't know whether this was significant. I asked Maren the evening after the vote, over tea in the diplomatic quarter. I had brought enough for the whole posting by then, a lesson well learned, whether she had known, when she read the charter that first night in the suite, whether any of it would work. She was quiet for a moment, in a way that wasn't evasion. It was the quiet of someone giving an honest answer the space it deserved. I knew what the charter said, she said. I didn't know whether anyone would honor it. Setharon could have found a different reading, I said. The chamber in Subappendix 7, there was room to argue it. There was, she held her cup, he didn't. You were counting on that. She considered this. I was counting on the possibility of it. A body that has run for 400 years on procedural integrity either means it or it doesn't. If it doesn't, the charter isn't worth filing forms about. She looked at the window, which showed Cassioth's evening, the amber green of the continent's edge dimming toward night, the pale silver of the distant ocean catching the last light. If it does, then you just need to have read the document more carefully than they expected. And if they'd found a way around it, then we'd have filed for the next session, she said, with the transcript of them finding a way around it attached. That would have been something. It would have been a different kind of useful, she said, and drank her tea. I thought about this for a while. Outside, Cassioth's sky went from amber to a deep indigo that I had not expected and had not seen before. It was extraordinary, actually, the specific quality of the light at that altitude, on a world with those atmospheric conditions, at that hour. I made a note to look up the atmospheric composition later, and then did not, and then eventually found the information in a geological survey 3 weeks later, and thought about how long Cassioth had been turning under that particular sky while the convocation met inside it. After a while I said, "Did it bother you, sitting in the gallery listening to Voroshan's remarks?" She looked up from her cup. "The filing comment," I said. "The forms, humanity being very good at filling out forms." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "He wasn't wrong." "He wasn't," she agreed. "We are good at filling out forms. We've had to be. The forms are how you stay in the game when the game has been running longer than you've been playing it." She set her cup down. "He meant it as a limitation." I thought it was a fair description of a strategy. "He thought he was making a joke." "He was making a joke," she said. "It was also accurate. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She looked at her tea. "The thing about that kind of laughter is that it comes from certainty. You laugh at something when you're sure you understand it completely. The laughter is the announcement that the analysis is done." She picked the cup up again. "He'd analyzed the forms." He hadn't analyzed who was filing them, or why, or whether someone who files correctly 11 times in a row might also read the document they're filing into. I thought about the nutrition bar wrapper, folded neatly in her jacket pocket. I thought about 11 years of forms, filed correctly and returned unaccepted. I thought about 4 envoys before Maren, each of whom had come home with nothing except an accurate understanding of what hadn't worked, and whose reports she had read with margin notes in a fine, precise hand. I thought about what the margin notes had said. I had filed those reports. I had not read them carefully until Maren asked me to. When I went back later and read her annotations, most of them were questions about procedure, questions about specific wording, questions about which officials had said what in which context. One note on a page from Envoy Park's report that described the committee structure said only, "Find the appendix." I have been in this work for 7 years now. I have been in a number of rooms where people said things about humanity that were not meant to be flattering, and I have watched Maren Voss sit in those rooms with the same mild attentiveness she brought to everything, and I have not once seen her look stung. I think it's because she genuinely doesn't experience those statements as wounds. She processes them as information. The information, in Voroshan's case, was that the classification committee had read humanity's metric profile thoroughly, and its procedural record not at all, which told her exactly what kind of opening existed, which told her exactly what to file. There is a version of this story in which Maren Voss comes home from the session feeling triumphant, and tells this story with a certain satisfaction that the room got what was coming to it, and the compact holds it up as a victory to be celebrated with something emphatic. That is not what happened. What happened is that she came home, filed the session report with her usual precision, noted the procedural precedent in the appropriate section of the compact's charter research database, and then went to find something for dinner, because it was getting late and neither of us had eaten properly since the nutrition bar. The session report is thorough and well written. In the conclusions section, she notes that the convocation appears to take its founding charter seriously, that Article 12, Subclause 9 had operated as written, and that the Chamber's presiding officer had demonstrated an admirable commitment to procedural integrity under circumstances that would have offered multiple routes to a different outcome. She recommends continued engagement with the convocation's standard submission process, notes that associate observer status creates a more productive platform for future applications, and suggests that the compact develop deeper familiarity with the convocation's charter appendices before the next session cycle. She does not describe it as a win, she describes it as a result. I have thought about those 11 years of submissions many times since. 11 applications, correctly filed and returned unaccepted. 4 envoys before Maren, each of whom went home with nothing except an accurate understanding of what hadn't worked. 11 years of humanity being, in Voroshan's formulation, very good at filling out forms and not yet at the threshold for meaningful engagement. And somewhere in those 900 pages of charter language, in a footnote directing readers to an appendix that directed them to a subappendix that contained the original drafting language from 4 centuries ago, was a clause that said, "If you are present, you have a right to be present on the record." The Rithanu had written that clause themselves in the original drafting of the charter, when the convocation was young and the drafters had been uncertain, and had resolved their uncertainty by leaving a door, because very certain people, if they are also careful people, sometimes leave doors for the possibility that they are wrong. And the door had been there for 400 years, and no one had walked through it, because no one had read the appendix carefully enough to know it was a door, or because the ones who found it had decided the door wasn't worth the attempt. Maren read the appendix. She decided the door was worth the attempt. She also brought a nutrition bar, which I think is, in its own way, equally important. You do not sit in an observer gallery for 3 hours on the chance that a 400-year-old charter clause will apply to your situation, unless you have thought carefully about the practical requirements of the undertaking. You bring what you need. You file the form. You show up before the session opens. The convocation's full chamber record from that session runs to 41 pages. The line that gets cited most often in the training materials, in the charter research database, in the briefings I give to junior attachés who are going to difficult rooms for the first time, is near the end. After the tabling of the vote, after Setharon's amended remarks, after the chamber had returned to its agenda, and was moving forward with the composure of a body that processes unusual events by returning to procedure. Setharon, before moving to item 6, asked whether the named representative had any final statement for the record. Maren said, "Only that we'll be back for the next session." Then she picked up her tablet, straightened her charcoal jacket, and walked out. We were,